My name is Elizabeth Harris, and I am 34 years old. From the outside, my life looked flawless. A steady marriage to my husband, Evan, 2 years strong, a cozy home tucked into the hum of the city, and the kind of routines that make neighbors whisper about how perfect we were. I smiled at our friends' compliments, laughed at Evan's jokes, and tucked away the small moments that didn't quite sit right in my stomach, chalking them up to personality quirks. But life, I was learning, rarely matches the pictures people frame for the world. Evan was charming, irresistibly so, and dangerously subtle. Sometimes, in the quiet of a Saturday morning breakfast, he'd drop a line about his ex-girlfriend, a woman he claimed was a famous lawyer, as if her shadow loomed over my very existence. "She'd have a field day if you tried to pull something like that," he said one Sunday, flicking a crumb from his shirt. "You know how protective she is about me." I forced a laugh, but the words tasted bitter. He wasn't talking about some abstract figure from the past. He was testing me, measuring me, reminding me that if I ever stepped out of line, or worse, considered divorce, there was a weapon in his past waiting to strike. A woman whose power, real or imagined, had been stitched into the fabric of my marriage from day one. I tried to dismiss it. I told myself Evan was just joking, that I was being paranoid. But the first time he mentioned her, I felt that flicker in my gut, the one that whispers danger when everything looks safe. And then it happened again and again. When I suggested we split our finances into separate checking accounts for our personal expenses, he froze, leaning back in his chair like a predator calculating his prey. "You think I'd let you do that? Rachel would have a field day if we divorced. Makes you look like you're hiding assets." Rachel. That was the name he always used for his ex-girlfriend, the supposed legal powerhouse whose approval or wrath could determine the fate of our marriage. He name-dropped her at least 3 times a week, sometimes mid-argument, sometimes in passing, as if I were meant to tremble at her unseen presence. I was quiet that day. I nodded, pretended it didn't rattle me, but inside a tiny ember of doubt had ignited. Who was this woman really? How much of what Evan said was true, and how much was simply a way to control me? The manipulation was subtle, almost invisible. When I asked him to contribute more to household expenses, despite earning less than me, he would shrug and say, "Rachel says a good husband provides." That single phrase, tossed casually into conversation, carried the weight of intimidation. It was always Rachel this, Rachel that. If I wanted to make a financial decision, there was Rachel looming over me. If I asked for transparency, Rachel would be the invisible judge of my actions. 8 months ago, after yet another argument over a loan I refused to co-sign for his cousin's business venture, I realized something. I wasn't just irritated anymore, I was trapped, and I was furious. I began to take notes, scribbling in a small, leather journal I kept tucked under the sink. Every name drop, every subtle threat, every manipulation cloaked as casual conversation. There was an insidious rhythm to Evan's strategy, a quiet, persistent tightening of control, and I wasn't going to ignore it anymore. Late one night, after he had fallen asleep, I opened my laptop and searched for Rachel Fitzgerald, Esquire, the famous lawyer who haunted my life through Evan's mouth. My fingers hesitated over the keyboard, a flicker of hope and fear battling inside me. I wanted to know who this woman really was. The results were underwhelming. Not a single headline, not a single case of legal triumph. Just a handful of social media profiles, a few amateur blog posts, and then, buried in a small local forum, a detail that made my heart skip. She wasn't a lawyer at all. Not in the capacity Evan had led me to believe, and she hadn't been practicing anywhere remotely prominent. A tremor of realization passed through me. Evan's ex-girlfriend, the shadowy figure he'd wielded like a sword over my head, was mostly a fabrication. 3 dates, 5 years ago. Nothing else. No power, no legal prowess. Just a woman he had briefly dated, nothing more. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a long, shaky breath. Every manipulated dinner, every veiled threat, every Rachel would say, suddenly snapped into focus. I'd been living under a carefully constructed illusion, and Evan was the architect. For the first time in months, I felt the spark of something I hadn't felt in years. Clarity. It was terrifying and exhilarating. That night, I made a decision. I would stop being a passive player in this game. I would prepare, document, plan, and if necessary, I would fight. Not with anger alone, but with evidence, strategy, and the truth. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a long, emotionally grueling path, one that would strip away the comforting facade of my marriage and expose the raw, dangerous reality underneath. I closed the laptop and stared at the ceiling, feeling both vulnerability and a new sense of power coiling in my chest. Evan had underestimated me. He always did. And I intended to make him pay, not for revenge, but for my freedom. After that night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was a tangle of questions and half-remembered arguments. Every casual threat Evan had ever made with Rachel's name attached came rushing back. Rachel would have a field day if you tried that. You don't want me calling Rachel. I'm just protecting us, like Rachel would. Each sentence had been a little dagger, and I hadn't realized how deep the wounds ran. By morning, I had made my plan. I needed to meet this Rachel, or rather, the woman Evan had twisted into a phantom of power, and uncover the truth myself. I couldn't rely on rumors, social media scraps, or Evan's version. I needed facts. I reached out using the sparse contact information I dug up online. A brief, cautious message. Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I'd like to clarify some things regarding past interactions with Evan. Are you available to talk? There was a pause that stretched unbearably, and then a reply. Yes, but I think you should know. I'm not a lawyer. Not really. I'm just a person. Call me if you want to hear the full story. My pulse quickened. A part of me wanted to scream with relief. Another part feared what this might uncover. That evening, I met her at a small cafe, tucked into a quiet corner. She was nothing like the image Evan had painted, not some towering, untouchable legal powerhouse, but a woman with a nervous smile and wary eyes, clearly amused and somewhat incredulous at my arrival. Elizabeth, right? She said, extending a hand. I've been wondering when someone would come looking for the truth. I swallowed hard, nodding. I need to know. Everything. Evan keeps mentioning you. He says you're a lawyer, that you're protecting him, that you could ruin me if I tried to leave. I need to know what's real. Her laugh was soft, almost sad. 2 years ago, you say? That's Evan's favorite story, isn't it? I felt my stomach twist. What do you mean? We dated, she said slowly, as if counting. 3 times. 5 years ago. That's it. And yes, I went to law school, but I'm not practicing, not in any capacity he ever described. And I certainly haven't been protecting him or watching over him. Ever. It hit me like a punch to the chest. All those nights of being threatened, all those subtle manipulations, the whispers of legal doom, it had been a lie, or at least a carefully constructed story designed to keep me in my place. I don't know what to say, I whispered. You don't have to say anything, she replied. You need to see it for yourself. Look at all the ways he's used me, and you'll understand how this isn't about me. It's about control. I left the cafe with my head spinning. Memories replayed in sharp focus. Every argument over money, every threat disguised as casual conversation, every time Evan had invoked Rachel's name to sway me. I had been ensnared in his web, believing that an omnipotent lawyer from his past could punish me at any moment. But the truth was far simpler and far more sinister. Evan had created the weapon himself. That night, I began documenting everything with renewed urgency. I collected text messages, notes, and financial records. Every time Evan mentioned Rachel, I recorded it. Every subtle manipulation, every gaslighting remark, every veiled threat, carefully noted. As I compiled evidence, I felt a dangerous thrill. For the first time, I realized I could fight back. I could expose the truth and finally reclaim my life. But with that power came fear. Evan wasn't a man to give up easily. He was clever, charming, and utterly ruthless when cornered. And I knew that once I moved, there would be no turning back. A week later, I confronted Evan, not aggressively, not with rage, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen behind the curtain. I met her, I said, holding his gaze steadily. Rachel, she told me everything. Evan's eyes flickered, a micro-expression that betrayed surprise, maybe even panic. But he quickly masked it with his usual calm, that charming smile that had once made me melt. She? He said lightly, feigning ignorance. Who? Your ex-girlfriend. The lawyer you keep bringing up. She's not a lawyer. She never practiced. You dated her 3 times. That's it. And you've been using her name to manipulate me this entire time. Evan's face remained neutral, but there was a tension beneath the surface, a tremor I could see if I looked closely. "Elizabeth, you're imagining things," he said smoothly. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. The seeds were planted. I had seen the truth, and I was no longer afraid. That night, I sat in my study, surrounded by files and notes, a meticulous record of months of deception. Each page felt heavy with proof, with the promise of justice, and with the thrill of impending liberation. I realized that Evan's greatest mistake was underestimating me, assuming fear would keep me compliant forever. But fear had been replaced by resolve. Betrayal had been replaced by strategy. And in the quiet of the night, I finally understood. The game was no longer his to control. I didn't know exactly how the confrontation would unfold. I didn't know how long it would take, or what battles lay ahead. But I knew this. I had uncovered the lie, and I was ready to wield the truth. Evan had built his empire of intimidation on a myth, and now I was about to shatter it. By the time I walked into the law firm that morning, I felt a strange mix of dread and exhilaration. My hands were clammy, my heart racing, but for the first time in years, I wasn't trembling out of fear. I was trembling with purpose. I had done my homework. I had meticulously documented every subtle threat, every name drop, every financial manipulation Evan had attempted over the past 2 years. So I had a timeline of arguments, screenshots of text messages, bank statements showing his reckless spending, and detailed notes on every time he invoked Rachel's name to intimidate me. I even had a statement from the ex-girlfriend herself confirming the truth. Rachel, or rather, the woman Evan claimed was a legendary legal force, was nothing of the sort. I introduced myself to Margaret Lane, the attorney I had retained, a seasoned woman in her early 60s with a reputation for dismantling the most stubborn manipulators. Her sharp eyes scanned my files, then she looked at me. "Elizabeth, you've done excellent work here," she said, her voice calm but firm. "This is a very clear case of manipulation, emotional abuse, and financial recklessness. And with the ex-girlfriend's testimony, Evan's threats lose all credibility." A sense of relief washed over me. Relief, yes, but it was tempered by anger. How could I have been gaslighted for so long? How many moments had I second-guessed myself, questioned my instincts, and allowed fear to dictate my choices? Margaret leaned back in her chair. "We're going to proceed carefully. Every step documented, every move strategic. The court will need a clear narrative, supported by evidence, of Evan's pattern of intimidation and manipulation. You're going to be very, very precise." I nodded, taking in every word. The plan was simple in theory. Present an airtight case showing that Evan had relied on a fabricated narrative to control me, while also documenting his financial irresponsibility and emotional coercion. But simple in theory didn't make it easy in practice. For the next several weeks, I devoted myself to preparation with almost obsessive focus. Every text, every Instagram post, every bank transfer, even minor expenses, was cataloged and cross-referenced. I created a timeline of Evan's tactics, noting every instance where he had tried to leverage Rachel's name to manipulate my behavior. Each entry fueled a growing fire inside me. This wasn't just about divorce. This was about reclaiming the sense of agency he had stolen from me. Evan, of course, remained oblivious, or so I thought. He carried on with the same casual arrogance, assuming that his phantom lawyer still wielded the invisible power he'd always claimed she had. He bragged about Rachel at dinner parties, flippantly referenced past manipulations, and laughed when I refused to co-sign loans or acquiesce to his financial whims. Each time, I smiled politely, silently recording the moment in my growing dossier. One evening, he leaned across the kitchen counter, lowering his voice in a way that was meant to intimidate. "You know, Elizabeth, Rachel wouldn't approve of you questioning me like this. If anything, I think he'd say you're out of line." I felt the familiar jolt of anxiety, but it didn't last. I didn't reply. Instead, I thought of every recorded threat, every piece of evidence, every confirmation from the ex-girlfriend. The power he had used to scare me for 2 years was evaporating, thread by thread. By the time our first pre-divorce meeting came, I felt calm and ready. Margaret guided me through every possible scenario, coaching me on what to say, how to respond, and what to emphasize. We rehearsed strategies, anticipated counter-arguments, and prepared for emotional manipulation. I had a newfound sense of agency that I hadn't felt since the day we married. The first confrontation with Evan was electric. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply laid out facts, dates, and evidence, letting the weight of truth do what words alone could never achieve. Evan's carefully constructed facade of dominance faltered under the pressure. He tried to charm, to gaslight, to name-drop Rachel once more, but Margaret had anticipated every move. And in that moment, I realized something profound. Evan had underestimated me. He had assumed fear would always keep me compliant, that his phantom lawyer would continue to terrify me into submission. But fear had been replaced by strategy. Betrayal had been replaced by preparation. I was no longer the frightened wife he could manipulate at whim. I was a woman armed with knowledge, evidence, and a lawyer who could dismantle his threats piece by piece. Still, even with the preparation, there was tension. Each phone call, each meeting, each glance exchanged carried the weight of 2 years of deception. I felt the subtle tremors of anxiety every time Evan spoke, reminding me that while I was ready, the path ahead would not be easy. But I had learned a crucial truth. The monster he had kept in the closet, the ex-girlfriend Rachel, was no longer a threat. The only danger left was Evan himself, and I was prepared to face him head on. That night, alone in my study, I reviewed the evidence once more. I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. For the first time in months, I felt in control. I had discovered the lie, documented the truth, and was ready to wield it. Evan's game of intimidation had an end, and I was the one writing it. The courtroom smelled of polished wood, stale coffee, and tension. I adjusted my blazer, trying to steady my racing heart. The polished surface of the table reflected my determined face back at me, a reminder that this was no longer a rehearsal. This was real. Evan sat across from me, leaning casually in his chair, a faint smirk playing on his lips. I could see it in his eyes. He thought he had already won. Rachel, the phantom legal powerhouse he had used to control me, was nowhere to be found. But somehow Evan believed his intimidation still lingered in the room. Margaret Lane, my attorney, was calm, collected, and sharp. She handed me my files one last time, giving me a look that said, "This is our moment." The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, surveyed the courtroom with the weary patience of someone who had seen far too many petty power struggles. She looked at us expectantly. "Ms. Foster," Margaret began, standing gracefully, "we are here today to address the manipulations, emotional abuse, and financial coercion perpetrated by Mr. Evan Foster over the past 2 years." The words felt heavy, weighted with all the months of suppressed fear, doubt, and anxiety I had endured. I watched Evan's smirk falter slightly, the first crack in his facade. Margaret began presenting evidence, screenshots of text messages, notes detailing threats and name drops, and detailed financial records of his reckless spending. Every piece of evidence was cross-referenced, every claim meticulously documented. And then came the final blow, the testimony of Evan's so-called ex-girlfriend, Rachel. She stood, calm and composed, and confirmed everything I had discovered, that she had dated Evan only 3 times, 5 years ago, and was not the influential lawyer he had painted her as. She had never been a legal threat, never acted as his protector, and had no role in any of his intimidation tactics. Evan's jaw tightened. His eyes darted between the two of us, searching for some foothold, some argument to regain control. But there was none. "You see, Your Honor," Margaret said, her voice precise, "the claims of legal threats are fabricated. The entire narrative of an omnipotent lawyer controlling Ms. Foster is a deception used to manipulate, intimidate, and coerce her." Evan opened his mouth, but no words came out. He tried to charm, to argue, to twist the truth, but the weight of evidence was undeniable. The courtroom air was thick with tension as his empire of lies began to crumble. I allowed myself a small smile, tempered by the reality that this confrontation was still emotionally draining. I could feel years of fear and betrayal unraveling inside me. The woman I had married, at least the version I thought I knew, was gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. Evan's face turned red, and for the first time he was silent. Margaret presented the final piece of evidence, a meticulous timeline of manipulations, financial records showing his reckless spending, and the confirmation from the ex-girlfriend that Rachel had never been involved. The judge leaned back, exhaling slowly. She had seen enough. Mr. Foster, she said, her voice firm, the evidence is clear. Ms. Foster has been subject to emotional manipulation and intimidation. Your claims about your ex-girlfriend's influence are unfounded and fabricated. Evan's lips pressed into a thin line. I could feel the shock radiating from him. All his attempts to control me, all his threats, all his smirks, they were meaningless now. The ruling was swift. Temporary support calculations were based on income. Debts incurred solely in Evan's name remained his responsibility. No alimony would be granted, and my attorney fees were accounted for. The court acknowledged the manipulation, the false threats, and the fabricated legal power. Justice, at last, had a voice. I left the courtroom that day with a strange mixture of relief, exhaustion, and vindication. I had confronted years of subtle psychological abuse, dismantled the phantom empire of Evan's deception, and reclaimed the narrative of my life. Walking out into the sunlight, I felt the first real sense of freedom I had known in 2 years. I had been underestimated, controlled, and manipulated, but now I was free. The storm of confrontation had passed, leaving me standing on solid ground, stronger, wiser, and finally in control.